Vivid verses.
The workshop smelled the way it always did on a Tuesday morning. Sawdust, machine oil, the particular sweetness of fresh-cut oak. And I was checking the joints on a set of kitchen cabinets when I heard the low, contented rumble of an engine that cost more than my annual turnover pulling into the yard next door. I didn't need to look up to know it was him. Our workshops sat side by side on the same industrial road, separated by a chain-link fence and about 9 years of diverging fortune. Mine did fitted joinery, cabinets, staircases, the odd bespoke door, and turned over enough to keep my wife and daughter comfortable, the mortgage paid, a modest holiday every summer. His did the same trade, more or less, but he'd scaled it into something else entirely. Showrooms, a fleet of branded vans, a staff of 12 where I had 3. We'd grown up 2 streets apart, apprenticed under different masters, and stayed close the way men do when the friendship predates any of the choices that later separate them. He came through the gap in the fence we'd cut years ago, still in his suit from whatever meeting he'd just left, grinning like a man who'd swallowed good news. "You'll never guess who I had lunch with," he said. "Go on then. Your dad." I set down my chisel. "My dad doesn't do lunch. He does tea at his own table at 4 o'clock. Well, he made an exception. He leaned against the bench, pleased with himself in the way he'd always been pleased with himself, a trait I'd long stopped finding irritating because irritation cost energy I prefer to spend elsewhere. We talked for 2 hours. He's sharp for his age, you know that? Sharper than sharp. I do know that. I think he's warming to the expansion idea. The second showroom. I've been putting a bit of time into him, if I'm honest. Taking him for tea, driving him to his appointments, that sort of thing. Man like that, he doesn't want to be pitched at. He wants to be understood. I looked at my oldest friend, a man I'd known since we were both small enough to be lifted onto our father's shoulders at the same summer fete, and felt nothing sharper than a kind of distant, patient amusement. He had spent months, by his own account, quietly courting my father's attention, not knowing my father, not really the way I understood him from 30-odd years of watching him say almost nothing and mean almost everything by it. "Good luck to you," I said, and meant it, and went back to my joints. That was the shape of things that spring. He was expanding. I was steady. His vans multiplied. Mine stayed at 2, one of which needed a new clutch I kept postponing. My wife noticed these things the way wives notice things, in small offhand remarks that accumulated the way sawdust accumulates on a shop floor. You don't see it happening until you're standing ankle-deep in it. "His wife's driving a new Range Rover," she said one evening, scrolling through her phone at the kitchen table while our daughter did her homework upstairs. "Is she?" "He's taking them to the Maldives in October." "Nice for them." "We haven't been anywhere since Cornwall 2 years ago." I didn't answer that one, because there wasn't an answer that would have satisfied her, and I'd learned by then that some silences are more honest than words. I wasn't a man who apologized for the pace of his own business. I built things properly, priced them fairly, paid my 3 men well and myself modestly, and slept without difficulty most nights. That had always felt, to me, like enough. It stopped feeling like enough to her sometime around the spring, though I couldn't have told you the exact week it happened. These shifts rarely announce themselves. They arrive the way wrought arrives in a beam, quietly from the inside, until one day the wood simply gives. She left in June. There was no scene, which I was grateful for, because I've never had much use for scenes. She sat me down at the kitchen table on a Sunday evening, our daughter asleep upstairs, and told me she'd been unhappy for a long time, and that she didn't think I could give her. She used the word give, which struck me even then as a curious way to describe a marriage, as though it were a vending machine that had stopped dispensing what she needed. "Is there someone else?" I asked, not because I needed the answer to feel steady, but because I wanted to know precisely what I was dealing with. She hesitated a half-second too long. "It's complicated." "Is it him?" Her silence told me everything her words wouldn't. I felt something move through my chest. Not rage, not the theatrical devastation I imagined she might have half expected, might even have wanted, some proof that I could be broken by this the way a man in a film might be broken. What I felt instead was a kind of clean, cold clarity, the same feeling I got when a project's number stopped working and I had to accept the loss and move to the next job, rather than keep sanding a board that would never be true again. "All right," I said. "That's it? All right. What would you like me to say?" "Something. Anything. Fight for this." "I'm not going to beg you to stay somewhere you've already left," I said. "You made your decision before you sat down at this table. I'm not going to perform for you now." She looked at me like she didn't recognize what she was seeing, and in a way, she was right not to. I don't think she'd ever seen me not perform for her, not argue for something, not push back, not ask to be reassured. I'd spent 9 years being steady in a way she'd apparently mistaken for something she could rely on indefinitely without ever needing to reciprocate it. Steadiness, it turned out, wasn't the same thing as being loved. It was just easier to leave. We handled the practicalities without lawyers drawing blood. I made sure of that. Made sure our daughter's life disrupted as little as possible. Made sure the house went to her and our daughter with a fairness that cost me more than I let on and that I never once mentioned to anyone. Because a man doesn't advertise his own decency. He simply practices it. My friend, for what it's worth, had the grace to avoid me for a month or two afterward, which I respected more than I expected to. When we did finally cross paths again, at the fence line, both of us reaching for tools in the yard at the same hour, he looked like a man bracing for a blow that never came. "I should say something," he started. "You don't need to. I feel like You haven't done anything I need explained to me," I said, and I meant in the driest possible sense. "We're grown men. She made a choice. You made a choice. I'm not going to spend the rest of my life relitigating it with you over a fence." He nodded slowly, as though this mercy unsettled him more than fury would have. Men like him, expansive men, men who lived a little in the theater of their own lives, always seemed thrown by the ones of us who simply declined to perform. I went back to work. That was, I think, the moment our friendship quietly ended, though neither of us said so out loud. We continued to nod at each other across the fence for months afterward, two men maintaining a courtesy that had outlived its substance. My father died in September. He'd been unwell for a while. Nothing dramatic, just the slow attrition of a body in its 80s. And I'd been visiting him twice a week at the house he'd lived in for 40 years, a modest terrace place he'd refused to leave despite my occasional suggestion that somewhere smaller, somewhere with a downstairs bathroom, might suit him better. He always waved the idea off with the same phrase, "I'm not dead yet, son." And then, one Thursday morning I got the call from his neighbor, who'd found him in his armchair, the radio still on, a cup of tea gone cold on the side table. I drove to the house, let myself in with my key, and sat with him for a while before the undertaker arrived, because it felt like the correct thing to do, not out of any performance of grief, but because it seemed wrong to leave him alone in that room a moment sooner than necessary. People expect a certain shape to grief, and I disappointed most of them. I didn't cry at the funeral. I gave a short, plain eulogy, no embellishment, just an accurate account of who he'd been, a quiet man, a careful man, a man who'd worked with his hands his whole life and never once complained about the work. I organized the wake with the same efficiency I organized a joinery contract. My ex-wife came, stood at a respectful distance, offered her condolences with a softness in her face that I recognized as genuine and didn't need. My friend came too, dressed somberly, and shook my hand at the door with both of his, the way people do when they want you to feel the weight of their sympathy. "He was a great man," he said. "I'm going to miss our chats. Thank you for coming. I said, and left it there because I had no interest in comparing the volume of our respective grief. What people mistook for coldness in me during those weeks was, in truth, just method. I'd learned from my father that a thing is handled properly or it isn't handled at all, and grief, to me, was not an exception to that rule. I processed it the way I processed everything, steadily, without an audience, mostly at night, alone in my workshop with the radio on low, running my hand along the length of oak the way he used to. I did not, in that period, know what he had actually been. The call came 5 weeks after the funeral on a Tuesday afternoon, while I was quoting a staircase job for a couple who kept interrupting each other to disagree about the handrail. "Is this a good time?" the voice on the phone asked once I'd stepped outside to take it. He introduced himself as a solicitor, gave a name I didn't recognize, and said he'd acted for my father for the better part of 30 years. "I didn't know my dad had a solicitor," I said. "He always used the one on the high street for his will." "He used the one on the high street for the will he wanted people to see," the man said, and there was something careful in the way he said it, the tone of a man who had been waiting a long time to say a true thing and had rehearsed how to say it gently. "I'd very much like to meet with you in person. There are matters concerning your father's estate that are substantial and private. I'd rather not discuss them over the phone. I've never been a man who alarms easily, and I didn't alarm then either, though something in his tone told me to clear my diary. We met 2 days later in an office. I'd never have guessed my father had any connection to glass and oak paneling, the kind of quiet expense that doesn't announce itself with logos. The solicitor was in his 60s, precise in his movements, and he opened a folder in front of me with the care of a man handling something combustible. "Your father," he said, "was not simply a retired tradesman living on a modest pension, as I understand you and most people believed." "No," I said, because it was already becoming clear that this was not a sentence that needed my agreement so much as my patience. 40 years ago, your father took a small inheritance from his own father and began investing it. Property, initially, then manufacturing interests, then a diversified portfolio of holding companies. He was extraordinarily disciplined about it. He kept every business under separate management, never let his name appear on a single public document if he could avoid it, and lived the entire time exactly as he appeared to live, modestly, in the same house, driving the same car for a decade at a time. I don't believe your mother, God rest her, ever knew the full extent of it. I don't believe you did either." "No," I said again, and this time the word came out slower. He slid a single sheet of paper across the desk, a summary, not the full accounting, which he told me would take weeks to formally settle, and I looked at a number that did not, at first, register as a number so much as an abstraction, a string of digits too large to attach any felt meaning to. Multiple billions. Pounds, not some lesser currency I might have misread it as. Businesses I'd never heard of, structured through trusts and holding entities with names that meant nothing to me, spanning manufacturing, property, and a shipping interest he'd apparently built almost entirely from nothing in his 30s. I didn't gasp. I didn't laugh or cry or do any of the things I imagine a lesser man might have done in that chair. What I did was ask questions, precise ones, the kind that mattered. Who else knows? Presently, only myself and now you. Your father was very deliberate about compartmentalizing the knowledge. Even his fund managers, in most cases, dealt with intermediaries rather than him directly. Why? The solicitor considered this. "I believe," he said, "your father did not want money to be the thing that shaped how people treated him or how his family related to one another. He watched wealth do terrible things to families he'd observed over the decades. I think, in his own quiet way, he was protecting you from something he'd seen happen to other men's sons." I sat with that for a long moment. It tracked, in the way that everything about my father had always tracked once you understood the whole shape of him rather than the visible corner of it. He'd never once, in my entire life, made a decision that wasn't 3 steps ahead of the one in front of it. "There's something else," the solicitor said, and here his tone shifted again, more careful still. "Among the private files your father kept, the ones he maintained personally rather than through his fund managers, there's a folder relating to your friend's business, going back several years." I went still. "Go on." "Your father had been quietly evaluating his company as a potential investment, reviewing the accounts, commissioning due diligence through a third party your friend never knew existed, watching how he ran the business, how he treated his staff, how he handled debt. This began, as far as I can date it, nearly 4 years ago, long before I understand the more recent developments in your personal life. I felt the floor of the last several months tilt slightly beneath me, the way a familiar room looks different once you learn a wall has been moved. All those months my friend had spent driving my father to appointments, taking him for tea, quietly angling for his favor and funding. He had believed, the whole time, that he was courting a retired tradesman's goodwill toward a modest loan. He had no idea he'd been under a magnifying glass for years already, that the old man pouring his tea and nodding along had already read every line of his balance sheet and formed a judgment about him long before either of them knew my marriage would end the way it did. And the conclusion, I asked, what did my father decide? The solicitor turned a page. "The file isn't fully conclusive. Your father hadn't finalized a position before he passed. But his notes suggest concern. Over-leveraged growth. A man, in his words, building width before he has built depth. He wrote that he wanted to watch a little longer before deciding anything." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, and it came out, unexpectedly, as something close to a laugh. Not cruel, not triumphant, just the release of a man who has just understood, all at once, the true dimensions of a joke he'd been standing inside for months without seeing the edges of it. He never invested. No. And he never told him any of this. No. As far as I can determine, your father let him believe exactly what he wanted him to believe, and watched, and drew his own conclusions in his own time. I thought of my father in his armchair, radio on, tea going cold. A man who had apparently spent the last years of his life quietly weighing the character of the man who would go on to marry his son's wife, and had done so without a flicker of it ever showing on his face. I felt something in that moment that wasn't grief and wasn't anger. It was closer to awe. "My advice," the solicitor said, near the end of that first meeting, "and I offer it not as your father's employee, but as a man who watched him build this over 3 decades, is that you say nothing. Not to your ex-wife, not to your friend, not to anyone. Take the time you need to understand the estate properly. Let the businesses continue to be managed exactly as they are by the people your father trusted until you've decided what you actually want to do with any of it. There is no version of announcing this that improves your life. There are several versions that would make it considerably worse. I didn't need convincing. It aligned entirely with an instinct I already possessed, the same instinct that had kept me quiet at the fence line, quiet at the funeral, quiet through the entire unraveling of my marriage. I had never been a man who needed an audience to validate the shape of my own decisions, and I wasn't about to start now, with stakes this large. "Agreed," I said. "Keep it exactly as it is. I'll come to you when I have questions. You understand," he said, "that you never need to work another day in your life." "Understand that," I said. "I also understand that I have 3 men on my payroll who rely on me showing up to the workshop on Monday morning. That hasn't changed." He looked at me for a moment with something that might have been approval, and I gathered later, from small comments over subsequent meetings, that this response was not the one he'd expected and was closer to the one my father would have given in my position, which I took, privately, as the highest compliment anyone had paid me in months. I went back to work the following Monday. Nothing about my day-to-day life changed in any way another person could have observed. I still drove the van with the postponed clutch, still quoted jobs to the penny, still argued gently with clients about handrail heights. What had changed was entirely internal, a kind of ballast settling low in my chest, invisible from outside, that meant nothing could unseat me anymore. I no longer flinched, even privately, at the sight of my friend's new van fleet growing by another vehicle, or my ex-wife's social media posts about the life she was building with him. Where before there had been a small, human ache at those things, not envy exactly, but a background awareness of scarcity, there was now simply nothing. A man doesn't measure himself against another man's showroom once he's seen the true size of what sits behind his own door, unspoken. But I didn't touch the money. Not for the workshop, not for the van, not even when the boiler at home gave out that November, and I paid for the replacement in installments like I always had. The fortune sat where my father had built it, managed by people who'd managed it for decades without my involvement, growing quietly the way it always had, while I did the much smaller, much slower work of rebuilding my own business with nothing but the same hands I'd always used. I worked the way my father must have worked in his 30s, before any of it existed, carefully, patiently, taking jobs I might once have declined as too small, treating every client like the account that mattered most, because in a sense every account did matter most to the business as it stood in front of me. I hired a fourth man in the new year, a young joiner with good hands and no confidence, and spent the extra hour most evenings teaching him the finishing techniques my own master had taught me 20 years earlier. I renegotiated with two suppliers who'd been quietly overcharging me for years, calmly, without threats, simply by presenting the numbers and letting the silence do the persuading. I turned down a low-margin contract that would have kept us busy but poor, and took instead a bespoke library commission for a client with more money than patience, which paid 3 times the margin and took half the time. None of this required the inheritance. All of it was made possible by the calm the inheritance gave me, the freedom to make decisions on their merits rather than out of fear, to walk away from a bad deal without the small private panic of needing this month's number to work. That distinction, I came to understand, was the entire point of what my father had built and never spent. Not the money itself, the freedom underneath it. By spring, the business had turned a profit I hadn't seen in 9 years of running it. By summer, word had started to spread. A kitchen fitted for a family whose neighbors asked who'd done it. A staircase that ended up photographed for a regional magazine. A reputation compounding the way reputations do once they cross some invisible threshold from adequate to sought after. I hired a fifth man. I quoted a job for a hotel refurbishment I would once never have had the confidence to bid on, and won it. My friend, for his part, began to notice. Not immediately. He was too consumed with his own expansion to look sideways at first. But by the time autumn came round again, a full year after my father's death, he was leaning over the fence more often, watching the new van arrive, asking careful, half-joking questions about how business was going. "You've turned a corner," he said one afternoon. Try to sound casual and not quite managing it. "We've had a good year," I said, which was true, and told him nothing. "Must be something in the water," he said, with a laugh that didn't quite land. And I let the silence answer for me, the way I'd learned to let silence answer for a great many things that year. It was October when my ex-wife texted me for the first time in months. "Can we talk?" Just us. Nothing heavy. I considered not answering at all. I owed her, by my own accounting, exactly nothing, but our daughters still moved between our two households, and I prefer to handle things directly rather than let ambiguity fester into something that might eventually cost my daughter comfort. I agreed to meet her at a cafe near her house, on neutral ground, on a Saturday afternoon while our daughter was at a friend's party. She looked well, better than well. In fact, the particular kind of well that comes from money rather than happiness, though I'd learned by then not to assume those were the same thing for her the way I once had. "Your business," she said, after the small talk had run its short course, "it's doing incredibly well. Everyone's talking about it." "It's doing better," I agreed. "I heard about the hotel contract and the magazine piece." She turned her coffee cup slightly, a small nervous gesture I remembered from years of marriage. "I suppose I wondered what changed. You seem, I don't know, different, steadier, somehow, even though you were always steady. It's like something's underneath it now." I looked at her for a long moment, weighing how much of the truth this conversation deserved, and concluded quickly and without much internal debate that it deserved almost none of it. "I worked hard," I said. "That's what changed. That's it. That's it." She studied my face for any crack in that answer and found none. Because there wasn't one to find, not because I was hiding a lie behind a straight face, but because the sentence, as far as she needed to know, was entirely true. I had worked hard. The rest was not information she'd earned the right to. "I've been thinking about us," she said then, and here her voice took on a different register, softer, angled towards something I recognized before she'd finished the sentence. "About whether we were too hasty. I think I mistook comfort, maybe financial comfort, for something it wasn't. I think I hurt you, and I think I hurt myself too, if I'm honest. He's not what I thought he'd be day to day. And you seem like you've built something real. Something I'd like to be part of again, if there's any chance." There it was, laid out plainly on the small round table between us, exactly as I'd half expected it might be the moment she'd texted. I did not feel anger. I did not feel a flicker of the old ache, the old wanting to be chosen that a lesser version of myself, a year and a half earlier, might have felt in this exact chair. What I felt was a clean, complete indifference, the kind that only arrives once a wound has actually finished healing rather than merely scabbed over. "I appreciate you being honest," I said. "But no," just like that. "You didn't ask me to fight for us when you left," I said, evenly, without an edge to it. "I'm not going to ask you to reconsider now that the numbers have changed. You made a decision based on what you thought my life was worth. I've made mine based on the same information you had at the time. Nothing's changed about what I think of that decision. I just stopped letting it cost me anything." "This isn't about the money," she said, though her expression told a slightly different story, one I chose not to argue with because arguing would have implied the outcome was in doubt. "Then it shouldn't matter that the answer's still no," I said. She didn't cry, to her credit, and I didn't soften to mine. We finished our coffees talking mostly about our daughter, her school, her upcoming birthday, the practical scaffolding of two separated parents who'd at least managed to keep that part of things civil. And I left the cafe feeling nothing heavier than I'd walked in with, which was, I understood by then, its own kind of victory. I never told her about the estate. I never told my friend either, though I heard secondhand, over the following year, that his expansion had begun to strain under its own weight roughly the way my father's private notes had predicted it would, a second showroom that underperformed, a cash flow problem that forced him to sell one of the properties he'd bought at the height of his confidence. He never came to me for help, and I never offered it, not out of malice, but because I understood by then that the kindest thing I could do for a man like him was let him learn, in his own time and on his own ledger, the lesson my father had already quietly read in his accounts years before either of us knew what was at stake. I put the fortune to work instead in ways nobody around me ever traced back to my name. Through the solicitor, and later through a small foundation set up with deliberate anonymity, I funded apprenticeship schemes for young tradespeople who couldn't otherwise afford the training. The kind of leg up my own father had never needed but had clearly spent decades quietly wishing existed for others. I funded a hardship fund at the trade college where I trained, structured so that no recipient ever learned who'd paid for it. I paid off, without ever revealing the source. The debt a struggling family 2 streets from where I grew up had accumulated after a house fire, arranged entirely through a local charity that believed the money had come from an anonymous community collection. None of it bought me anything. None of it was meant to. It simply felt, in the same quiet way my father must have felt it for 30 years, like the correct use of something too large for one man's comfort to justify keeping entirely to himself. My own business kept growing on its own separate, honest terms. Not because it needed the inheritance behind it, but because I'd finally built the version of it I'd always had the ability to build once fear had stopped being the thing steering my decisions. By the following spring, we'd outgrown the original workshop and moved into a larger unit 2 roads over, taking on staff I could genuinely afford rather than staff I was stretching to justify. I kept the same modest house. I kept driving a sensible car. I still went to the workshop most mornings before anyone else, made the tea, checked the week's schedule, and worked with my hands until the lights started to go. People who didn't know any better assumed I'd simply had a good run, a lucky contract, a change in the market, the kind of turnaround that happens to steady men who wait long enough for their patience to pay off. I let them believe that because it was, in its own way, true. I had waited. I had worked. I had been patient in a manner that had cost me nothing performative and asked nothing of anyone else's sympathy. What sat behind it all? The number too large to hold any real meaning. The businesses my father had spent a lifetime building in total silence. The folder with my friend's name in it, and the judgment my father had never lived long enough to finish forming, stayed exactly where it belonged. Unspoken, unclaimed, entirely mine to carry without ever needing another soul to know the weight of it. On the evenings, I locked up the new workshop and drove home past the old one, past the fence we'd cut through as boys, past the yard where his vans still came, and went a little fewer of them than the year before. I never felt the old ache. I felt, instead, something closer to what I imagined my father must have felt for 30 quiet years. The calm of a man who has built something real, said almost nothing about it, and let the truth of it simply stand, unchallenged, in the ledger only he could read.
Thanks for listening.